Dr. Dawson, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome virtually to my country, and we are very happy to have you here, and we will enjoy very much your presentation.
Entonces
Thank you so much.
disfrutaremos
Thank you.
su presentación. Muchas gracias.
Shall I begin now?
¿Podemos comenzar? Pregunta la doctora.
Yes, you can.
Okay.
Bien.
First, I'd like to thank you for
Primero
inviting
deseo
me.
agradecer por la invitación.
I would like to thank you for the invitation to
Agradecer por
participate.
la invitación para participar en este Congreso de Reumatología.
Can you hear me?
Pregunta a la doctora si se le puede escuchar y yo también pregunto si se puede recibir la interpretación.
Okay.
Ambas cosas.
Okay. Today
Gracias.
I'm going to discuss the
Bueno,
role of
ahora me
vitamin
referiré
D
acerca del papel de la vitamina D
in bone and muscle health in
en
older
la salud
adults.
ósea y muscular en adultos de edad avanzada.
First, we're going to look at calcium and
En
vitamin
primer
D
lugar, vamos a
status
ver el estado de
in
calcio y
Peru.
vitamina D en Perú.
This is a
Y esto
summary
es
of
un
the
resumen
prevalence of
de
vitamin
la
D
prevalencia de
insufficiency,
la insuficiencia de
defined
vitamina
here
D
as
que
a
nosotros
25
encontramos aquí
hydroxy D level less than
como
20 nanograms per
25
mil,
hidroxi
or 50
vitamina
nanomoles per
D
liter.
en menos de 20 nanogramos por
In the
mililitro o 50
Americas,
nanomoles por litro. En
about
las Américas, alrededor de
30% of the
de un
South
30%
American
de
population
la
has a
población en
level that
Sudamérica
is
tiene un
below
nivel
30
que está por
nanograms.
debajo de 30 nanogramos.
And you don't see
Y
Peru
nosotros no
here,
vemos a Perú aquí en esta lista,
but your neighbors,
pero sus
Colombia
vecinos,
and Ecuador, have roughly
Colombia y
20
Ecuador, tienen más o menos
25%
20-25% de este tipo
Similarly,
de valores.
the
Entonces,
calcium
aquí,
intake
la
in
ingesta de
Peru
calcio en
has
Perú,
been studied, and
esto ha sido
it is
estudiado,
on average
y esto en promedio
370
es
milligrams per day.
370 miligramos
This
por día.
is
Y
far
esto
below the
está
recommended
bastante
level
por debajo de los niveles
of
recomendados
1,000 milligrams.
de 1000 miligramos.
Here is a global
Aquí
review that we
tenemos una
did
revisión
a few
global
years ago,
que hicimos algunos
showing
años atrás, mostrando
that your neighbors
que vuestros vecinos
have intakes very
tienen
similar to
ingestas de
the
vitamina D
intake
que son
in
muy
the one
similares
survey
a la
in
ingesta
Peru.
encontrada en la encuesta en la evaluación en Perú.
So against that backdrop,
Entonces, sobre esta base,
let's look at how
miremos
a
entonces
vitamin
cómo
D
la
insufficiency
insuficiencia de
may
vitamina D
affect
puede
fracture
entonces
risk.
afectar el riesgo para tener fracturas.
We know it comes down through this
Nosotros
axis,
sabemos que va por
We're-
esta vía
and we are certain that there's an
y
increase of
estamos
fall risk
con certeza de que hay un aumento
with
en el
low
riesgo
D
de
levels.
caídas con niveles bajos de vitamina D.
We're not so sure of the mechanism,
No
but
estamos
we
tan
know that
seguros
the
de cuál es el
result
mecanismo
is more
subyacente, pero
falls,
conocemos que la
which
consecuencia
is
es
the
mayor frecuencia de caídas, lo cual
trigger
entonces
for more fractures.
desencadena más fracturas.
So the combination of vitamin D
Entonces, la combinación de
insufficiency
insuficiencia de
and
vitamina
low
D
calcium
y
intake
niveles
is
bajos de calcio o
particularly
ingesta baja de
unfortunate
calcio es particularmente
because it
desafortunada
leads
porque
to less calcium absorbed,
lleva a una
parathyroid
menor
hormone
absorción de
level,
calcio, aumento de la paratormona,
more turnover and loss
más
of bone,
renovación
and
ósea y
more
pérdida
fractures.
de hueso y por cierto a más fracturas.
So what's the evidence?
Entonces, ¿qué evidencia tenemos?
In terms of
En términos
effect on muscle
del
strength
efecto
and
en la fuerza
performance,
muscular y en el desempeño de
vitamin
los
D
músculos,
was
la
studied
vitamina
in a
D fue
meta-analysis
estudiado en
of
un
54
metaanálisis,
trials. It included all kinds of doses and
entonces incluyendo
study
todos los
duration,
tipos de dosis y
and
diferentes
looked at a
duraciones de los
series
estudios.
of possible
Entonces se hizo una
outcomes.
serie de posibles resultados.
Here are the
Aquí
results
están los
for
resultados
the
para
timed up and go test, which is
el
probably
tiempo de
the
la
most
prueba de up
sensitive
and go, de
of
levantarse,
the
que quizás es
measures.
la más sensible de las mediciones que se tienen
And you
disponibles.
see no
Y
effect
ustedes observan que no hay
whatsoever
mayor
of
efecto
vitamin D
de la
supplementation
suplementación con
on
vitamina
timed up
D
and go.
en el tiempo para levantarse o la facilidad para levantarse de la silla, ponerse de pie.
Similarly, there was no effect
Similarmente, no hubo mayor
on any
efecto
of these
en
other
ninguno de los
outcomes.
otros resultados.
And now on to falls. We know
Ahora,
that
desde
from
el
an
punto de
early
vista de las caídas,
meta-analysis,
sabemos de un metaanálisis anterior
people supplemented with
que
doses
las personas
700
suplementadas con
to
dosis de
1,000 units per day had
200
lower
a 1000 unidades por
risk
día
of
tuvieron
falling.
menores riesgos para caerse, menor riesgo de caídas.
Now, in the last 10 years, we've
Ahora, en
seen
los últimos 10 años
publication
hemos
of
visto
many
la
mega
publicación de
trials
muchos mega estudios
looking at vitamin D supplementation.
mirando la suplementación de la vitamina D.
Here is one, the
Aquí
recently
tenemos
published VITAL
uno,
study,
el estudio Vital recientemente
and
publicado,
you will see no
y
effect on
observamos que
fall
no hay mayor efecto en las caídas.
in over 25,000 participants.
Esto en
The
25,000
important thing
participantes, y lo importante acá es que
is that they started at a
ellos
25 hydroxy D level of 30.8
comenzaron con un nivel
nanograms
de
per mil.
25 hidroxide de 30 nanogramos por
That
mililitro.
is in the middle of the
Esto está
desired reference
en
range.
el medio
the
del rango
optimum
de
range.
referencia deseado, en medio del rango óptimo.
So it tells you that if you have
Entonces,
enough
esto nos
D,
dice que
taking
si
more is not
tenemos,
helpful.
si tomamos más cantidad o una mayor cantidad de vitamina D, esto no es de gran ayuda.
So on the
Entonces,
other side, there
por
is
otro lado,
now significant
ahora
evidence that
hay evidencia
taking
significativa
high
que
doses of vitamin D
al tomar dosis elevadas de
will
vitamina D,
actually increase fall risk.
esto puede más bien aumentar el riesgo de caídas.
Let's look at the evidence.
Miremos la evidencia.
Sanders first noted this
Sanders observó por
when
primera vez este fenómeno
treating people with
y tratando a las
500,000
personas con
units once a year,
5,000, 500,000 unidades
seeing increased risk of
internacionales
falls
una vez
in
por año,
older women.
un mayor riesgo de caídas en mujeres de edad avanzada.
Here's another example from
Aquí tenemos
the
otro ejemplo de
D-Health Australia
el
mega
estudio
trial,
D-Health en Australia, un mega estudio.
and you will see that
Y ustedes
overall
observan que
there was no
aquí
effect on
no hubo
falls,
mayor efecto en las caídas en forma
but
global,
in the
en la totalidad de los
subset
participantes,
analysis
pero en el análisis de los subgrupos,
shown here,
que
they
es lo que
sorted
aparece
the data
acá,
by their
entonces
BMI.
esto al dividirse de acuerdo con el índice de masa corporal,
Those who had a high
los que
BMI
tenían un elevado índice de
had
masa
no effect of
corporal,
D on falls. But
no
look at
hubo
this.
efecto en las caídas, pero miren acá,
If the BMI was
si el
less
índice de
than
masa corporal
25,
era menos de
there was
25,
a significant increase in
entonces había un
falls.
aumento significativo en las caídas.
And why might that differ by
Y
BMI? It's
podríamos
because
señalar que esto es diferente, y esto es porque
BMI,
el índice de masa corporal,
yeah, you get a smaller increase in the 25
tenemos
hydroxy
aquí
D
un
for a given
aumento
dose
leve en la
with a
25
higher
hidroxide,
BMI.
y esta relación se evidencia con estos niveles más altos del índice de masa corporal.
Now, we looked
Ahora
at
bien,
this
nosotros
fairly
revisamos
recently
esto
in our Stop It
relativamente
trial.
reciente en nuestro estudio Stop It.
This was healthy older men and women
Estas mujeres
treated
y varones saludables de edad
700 units
avanzada
of D and
que
500
recibieron
milligrams of
700 unidades de
calcium
vitamina D y 500
or double placebo for 3 years. These people were enrolled long before there was widespread supplement use or food fortification in the United States. And the participants agreed not to take their own supplements. So what we measured was the 25-hydroxy D level measured every 6 months for 3 years. We took the average on supplementation and the average in the placebo group and looked at the association between average vitamin D level over 3 years and risk of falling. And we saw a U-shaped pattern, wherein the vitamin D levels of those when they were under 20 nanograms per mil, there was a greater risk of falling. When the D levels were higher than 40, there was similarly a greater risk of falling. The nadir region for falls was in the 20 to 40 nanograms per mil. So this is the third example of increased risk of falling. The associations in a similar pattern have been observed with fracture risk. In the right-hand panel, there's a show of a study out of Australia that looked at quintile of 25-hydroxy-D level and fracture risk. And you will see that same U-shaped pattern. If you're in the referent range here of 23 to 29, you had the fewest fractures. Oops. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, good. I think what explains the mix of findings with vitamin D, does it or does it not reduce fall risk? It may be explained by this pattern here. This is the physiologic function in relation to nutrient status. And this pertains to many nutrients, I believe, including vitamin D. If you're insufficient, you get a benefit. If you start here, you get no benefit by taking more, unless you take too much more and you start to see harm. So in the case of the vital study, they started here and moved over to here. This would be the 30, and this would be 40 nanograms per mil. And so what you're looking at there is a mix of increased risk, decreased risk, and no change, with the bulk of the people in the no change in risk category. The mega trials have been conducted in countries where vitamin D supplementation has become very widespread. In the United States, for example, between 2001 and 2017, there has been a 19-fold increase in vitamin D sales. So it is no surprise that if you don't recruit people with low intakes for your studies, you're going to come up with a null result. So how might vitamin D be affecting fall risk, since we saw that there's no evidence for the muscle mass and the muscle strength? Possible mechanisms, well, as I say, they've been treating replete people. The other likely one is that vitamin D is improving balance. There have been a couple of very small sway trials showing that vitamin D in deficient people, they will be more stable with vitamin D. Another kind of interesting possibility is that the high dose D, we know it stimulates the release of FGF23 from osteocytes. And FGF23 is highly associated with frailty and with impaired muscle growth and development. So that's another candidate. But really, we don't have a real clear idea of why D insufficiency results in more falls. Let's now look at the evidence for fractures. Do calcium and vitamin D individually or in combination affect fracture risk? Start with an observational study from the Swedish mammography cohort looking at calcium intake from the diet And you'll see as intake increases up to around 700, 800, you'll see increased risk of hip fracture, and then it rather stabilizes after that. So there was a meta-analysis that Michel Ferrari conducted 12 years ago now, showing that calcium alone is not having a notable effect on non-vertebral or hip fractures. The thinking changed with the publication of the now very famous Chapuis study, which looked at modest doses of vitamin D and calcium supplementation in old nursing home women who had quite low vitamin D levels and inadequate calcium status. Now, this 511 is more than we're seeing in Ecuador, but it's still inadequate. And when supplemented, this group had a very robust decreased risk in hip and other non-vertebral fractures. Yao published an important meta-analysis of the calcium and vitamin D trials, looking at the effect on any fracture and on hip fracture of supplementation with the combination of calcium and D. So you'll see of these trials, there was no significant, well, I guess it just did make significance, a 6% reduction in any fracture. And very importantly, a 16% risk reduction for a hip fracture. That's a big reduction for an inexpensive supplement. When we look at the same picture at the actual doses that were used, they were consistently 800 units of vitamin D, except for one study, and that was the Women's Health Initiative, the Jackson report. They used 400. So there were no high doses, there were no intermittent doses. And calcium was given in the amount generally around 1,000 milligrams per day. In this, and as we saw, this tremendous risk reduction in the hip fracture. Let's look at the effect of vitamin D alone in the same meta-analysis. There were more trials. And for any fracture, there was no significant difference, but there was almost a trend toward more fractures, and the same trend, but not quite significant, for more fractures with D alone. Now, again, let's look at what the D supplements tested were, and there were a few that were very low doses, 400, 800, but many of them had high intermittent doses. As you can see, 100,000 units every 3 months or every 4 months, and that is yielding absolutely no benefit whatsoever. So if you're going to supplement, use calcium and D and use it in modest daily doses. I wanted to point out the importance of calcium and vitamin D supplementation in patients who are being treated for osteoporosis, and this would pertain to a lot of your patients. Note that I'm showing here the risk reductions and the supplement use in the pivotal registration trials for the drugs. And you'll notice that on every single trial, a pivotal trial, there was calcium supplementation in the amounts of 500 to 1,000 milligrams a day. The vitamin D supplementation was universal as well. The risk reductions are magnificent. Look at these risk reductions for vertebral fracture, and we're tested very substantial risk reductions for hip fracture as well. So the take-home message here for me is, if you're going to use these drugs, which I hope you do, that you have no guarantee of their fabulous fracture risk reduction in the absence of calcium and D supplementation. So it needs to be the combination. I'll remind you that there is an increase in hip fractures with that very high annual dose study that Sanders led. And so same as for falls, more fractures. I want to mention a few things about the approach to correcting insufficiency and deficiency. In older adults, as I hope I've indicated, 600, you go up to 800 to 1,000 units a day, and there's no, in the general population, no need to measure 25-hydroxy-D. Please avoid intermittent doses, even though they may be more convenient. They are, I think, highly, I'm skeptical of their use. And you want to move the calcium intake in your population, which you can probably assume is somewhere around 350 to 400 milligrams, up to around 1,000. And you can do it with 500 or 600 milligram supplement a day. For high-risk older adults, those with established osteoporosis, obese, confined to indoors with malabsorption, you would measure their 25-hydroxy-D level and supplement them to reach a level of 20 nanograms per mil or higher. 100 units will increase the 25-hydroxy-D by about 1 nanogram. That's a rule of thumb that you can use to estimate the dose you're going to use. You want to remeasure in these special patients the 25-hydroxy-D level and adjust the dose as needed and ensure adequate calcium. So if you're going to recommend calcium carbonate as the supplement, notice that the absorption is highly less variable if it is taken with a food, with a meal, as opposed to on an empty stomach. So you would want them to take their supplement with a meal. It doesn't matter which meal. The other thing on vitamin D supplements, many of them come in an oil capsule, and those may be taken at any time of day. If you're using a pill that does not have oil in it, it's not a capsule, it's a pill, then that should be taken with a food containing some fat. And the reason is shown here that you get about 30% higher absorption of the vitamin D under that circumstance than were you to take it fasting. It doesn't matter whether you use D2 or D3, you might need a little higher dose with D2. Most of the supplements these days, at least here in the US, are D3. And when you're going to remeasure those special patients I mentioned earlier, you want to wait about at least 3 months before repeating the level, because as shown in panel B, it takes that long to reach steady state after you change the intake. So don't measure too soon, or you won't get a reliable estimate of what that level will deliver over time. And finally, assays have become a big subject because there's high variability from one to another. The LC-MS-MS assay, the mass spec assay, is the gold standard. Where it is not available, the diasorin assay may be used. It's used very widely in that circumstance, and it gives results that are fairly similar. But you should have the laboratory at your hospital or in your practices standardize their assay to the DACOS or to the NIST standards. And this is a way that will allow cross calibrations to be done. Should a patient move from one location to another, you will know whether it's an assay difference or whether it's a real difference in 25-hydroxy-D in that regard. So my conclusions, 600 to 800 up to 1,000 with adequate calcium will reduce risk of falls and fractures, and it will not increase risk of overshooting and causing adverse effects on falls and fractures. D without adequate calcium does not lower fracture risk, so don't go there. All patients taking pharmacotherapy require vitamin D and calcium supplementation, and daily dosing is strongly advised. It avoids that increase in FGF23 that is detrimental, and it will have a more favorable effect on falls and fractures, lowering their risk. So with that, thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctora Dawson Hughes, por la excelente presentación. ¿Están traduciendo, perdón? Hola. Perfecto, gracias. Muchísimas gracias por la excelente presentación, doctora Dawson Hughes. Realmente para nosotros el problema de vitamina D existe, lo tenemos presente y hace algunos años atrás publicamos un estudio tomando una muestra de pacientes reumáticos, no de población general, sino de pacientes reumáticos en Lima, y alrededor del 80-85% de la población que evaluamos tenía valores de 25-hidroxivitamina D por debajo de 30 nanogramos sobre mililitro. Y en la práctica diaria, obviamente tratando pacientes, encontramos muy comúnmente valores bajos de vitamina D. El punto que quiero comentar es el uso de megadosis como terapia de mantenimiento. No es frecuente, pero sí vemos muchas veces prescripciones de dosis altas de vitamina D, 600.000, 100.000, usadas como terapia de mantenimiento a largo plazo, lo cual sabemos que tiene efectos deleterios y es mejor usar una dosis diaria en estos pacientes. Pero me gustaría un comentario suyo acerca de cómo se considera o cuándo debemos considerar que es una megadosis, sobre qué límite de dosis, y si existe algún momento clínico en el cual podemos usar megadosis en algunos pacientes, por favor. Hay que ajustar la traducción. ¿Quieren que repita la pregunta, por favor?
Te la puedo traducir, Luis. Can you hear me, Bess?
I can now.
Hola.
Yeah.
Yes, you can
speak in
hear
English.
me, but you're not listening to the translator. No.
No.
No. Okay, Luis Vidal was asking a question.
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. Yeah.
No, but I can, if I remember it, I can translate it to you.
Okay.
So
great.
first was, if you consider in your clinical practice at certain, for example, moments, the use of megadoses, and what you consider a megadoses.
Yes, please.
I consider doses of 10,000 to 2,000
Yes.
and up is more than you need. There is just no reason to be giving doses above the amount required to get into the optimum 25-hydroxy-D range. Normally, that will be a total intake of around 800 to 1,000 units. So going above that is not good unless you have a patient with malabsorption. It's where you have to keep dosing to get there. So megadose is not a fixed number. It varies according to circumstance. But you absolutely don't want to do monthly dosing. It's a problem with increasing fall risk. It's common practice to do a
Perfecto. Thank you so much for the clarification, Dr. Dawson Hughes.
Yeah.
¿Alguna pregunta del auditorio, por favor?
I do have a well, I can translate to you some of the
Yeah.
questions that I'm seeing, Luis, if you let me. Some of the questions that I'm seeing here in the chat.
Yeah.
And well, one of
Pregunto.
mine is that if
Pregunto.
we are making advances in
Pregunto.
Hay una pregunta del auditorio
marker
previa, por favor.
for
Adelante,
bone,
Elena.
for
Quisiera la
muscle
opinión de
waste.
la doctora acerca de la asociación de la vitamina D con K.
I can't, I'm not getting that in English. I don't understand it.
Vitamin D and vitamin K.
Yeah, if there's an association of vitamin D and K vitamin.
No, they're independent.
They're completely independent.
Yeah.
Another question is the same thing, or is the same thing to treat deficiency of vitamin D with calcitrol instead of D2 or D3?
Okay, there are calcitriol is 1,25-dihydroxy-D. That's a very active compound, and it is well known to be inappropriate in people who can absorb D who have kidney function. It causes intermittent hypercalcemia, and you have to be very careful and keep checking the serum calcium levels. It is used in renal failure patients who cannot generate their own 1,25-dihydroxy-D. But in the average or typical osteoporotic patient, no. Similarly, there is use of the 25-hydroxy-D, and that can be used in circumstances of vitamin D malabsorption. The hydroxy component of that makes it less hydrophobic. So 25-hydroxy-D is absorbed more efficiently than vitamin D itself. So it's an alternative in those with malabsorption. I would see no other reason to use 25-hydroxy-D.
Thank you. I do have two questions for you. The first one is, are we making any advance of having a marker that could lead us through muscle wasting? Because once I hear that urine creatinine could be in the future a very easy marker in order to learn about muscle wasting, and then in the future we can see the association of falls with creatinine in patients.
There's the D3 creatine dilution method. We've recently employed that in a study that assesses muscle wasting. It's expensive. It's not terribly reproducible, we have found. Whether it will be a good marker over time, I don't know. In the meantime, a marker that can be used is a 24-hour urinary nitrogen measure. That is easy to measure. If you control the nitrogen intake the night before the urine collection starts and during the collection, where people are have a low nitrogen or protein intake, changes in urine nitrogen can, if adjusted for intake, can be a useful research measure. I'm not sure that we have a good marker for the individual patient.
Okay, and then the second one, well, it is because of the I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, the last meta-analysis that you showed to us.
Yeah.
What I notice is that most of the confident intervals trespasses the one, but
Yes.
in one study. So really, we really want to know if these results are really, good.
I think the one for the calcium and vitamin D combination is significant, and the confidence intervals don't cross 1. So there's a clear indication of that an 800 unit dose of D together with calcium will lower fracture risk. And note that the studies of calcium and D in these low doses were all done before widespread D supplement use. So the populations were insufficient.
Okay.
That's the key. That's the key difference. With the D alone studies, they're looking at adequate populations and looking at all kinds of doses and dose frequencies. And it doesn't show anything.
Okay, thank you. Luis, ¿tienes alguna otra pregunta por ahí?
¿Alguna pregunta del auditorio, por favor? Sí, pásenme el micro, please.
All set?
Buenos días.
Oh, it's
La
just one.
pregunta es si los niveles que tenemos actualmente, por ejemplo, de 30, ¿son los adecuados o habría que de repente subirlos a 40 en algún tipo de pacientes para considerarlos como valores normales?
So the question is regarding the levels of concentration of 25 hydroxy vitamin D.
Yeah.
Do you think that in certain moments it is adequate to increase them to 40 milligrams, or there's no need to go beyond the 30 milligrams?
I think for the general population, you do not need to go above 20 nanograms per mil. For osteoporotic patients, I would want to be around 30, but you don't need to go higher than that. Going higher doesn't add any benefit.
Okay, thank you. Luisito.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta, por favor? Adelante.
Buenos días. La pregunta es la siguiente. Pacientes en condiciones especiales, como por ejemplo pacientes con artritis reumatoide, osteoporosis o pacientes con hiperparatiroidismo y osteoporosis secundaria, ¿los requerimientos de vitamina D pueden ser mayores de 1000 unidades?
Okay. The question is that in a special population, for example, patients that has rheumatoid arthritis or hyperthyroidism, will you go higher than 1,000 per day, international units per day?
I would consider those special populations, and I would want their level to be at 30 nanograms, not 20. And it may take more than 1,000 units to get there, but I would test, put them on 1,000 units, test 3 months later, and see whether you need to add to that dose.
A higher dose. Bien. ¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Doctor Dawson Hughes, en los pacientes con hiperparatiroidismo, ¿usted recomienda algún ajuste en la dosis de calcio y vitamina D, por favor, paciente con hiperparatiroidismo que requiere obviamente tratamiento antirresortivo? ¿Se requiere algún ajuste en las dosis de calcio y vitamina D?
Okay, the specific questions is in patients with hyperparathyroidism that are using anti-resortive drugs because osteoporosis. Do you think that there must be an adjustment in vitamin D or calcium intake?
This is for hyperthyroid. Is that what you said?
Yes.
High thyroid.
Hiperparatiroidismo, por favor.
Well, presumably they are going to be treated for the thyroid condition into a euthyroid state, but I still would aim for around 30. I don't think that they may need more to get to 30, but once you control the thyroid, they should be like everyone else in the special category.
Bess, would you consider 2,000 units per day per 3 months in order to correct if they have less than 30?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
not more than 2,000.
Yeah.
Okay.
Ok, gracias. ¿Alguna pregunta más de parte de la auditorio, por favor?
Muchas gracias, doctora.